Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And I'm coming to you back at it with my march through a personal Black Film History Month, delighted to say that a film that I was highly anticipating seeing this year, that I had already mentioned being agonized over not being able to see last week on our last edition of the New Movie Diary. Well, that film in question, My Father's Shadow, finally made its way in the second official week of its limited rollout to the Angelica Film Center in New York City. This is a debut feature for British-Nigerian director Akinola Davies Jr., co-written by his brother Wale Davies, and while I'll be taking advantage of this as a way to spotlight the shamefully sparse representation of Black artists both in front of and behind the camera leading up to this Valentine's Day weekend, at least as far as cinema in the United States, I should, of course, emphasize that this is an international co-production primarily financed by BBC Film that, insofar as I think it certainly warrants inclusion on this side of the Atlantic as part of the proper Respect for Black Film History Month, a contemporary and ongoing example of Black film history, it should go without saying that My Father's Shadow is also part of a contemporary and ongoing story of Black and African diaspora film history. My Father's Shadow is a recent period piece set in Nigeria in the summer of 1993, and our primary interlocutors throughout the majority of the film are two child brothers, the eldest Remy and the younger Akin, played by sibling actors Chibokwe and Godwin Egbo, whose father, Falarin, played by the breakout TV star Sope Dirisu, is compelled to spend extensive time away from his family and their local rural town in order to work in the capital city of Lagos. When the younger Akin begs, Falarin agrees to take the boys with him. Shot entirely on 16mm film, a much smaller film format that accentuates the grainy indexicality of film while also producing a shallower depth of field, creating a fine mixture of naturalism and a dreamy unreality. What follows is both a road movie and a coming-of-age film, and then a socio-political urban saga all rolled into one, told in episodic vignettes, sometimes punctuated by moments of magical realism that seem to portray the unfolding of this story within a memory. Akinola and cinematographer Jermaine Edwards' camera follows Remy and Akin's gaze so intimately that much of My Father's Shadow becomes simply that, a constant act of looking and trying to fit pieces together and understand what we are watching. There are two main parallel narratives at work here, one of course being that coming-of-age journey between these boys and their father, who, as it's revealed once we learn that not only has Falarin not been paid by the factory that employs him in some 4 months, but he actually hasn't been working there actively put on the employee ledgers for some weeks, all begging the question, well, if the hours that Falarin has received are so inconsistent and unreliable, and if he hasn't actually been receiving a wage in all that time, then why has he been spending all of his time in Lagos? This confrontation between an estranged but innocent conception of their father in these boys' eyes and a sudden, shocking exposure to who he really is as a full human being. What the world really sees while they have seen so little of the illusion at all. The second narrative then ends up being the socio-political one, as the climate surrounding Nigeria's first presidential election since a 1983 coup establishes a humid tone of tension and uncertainty. It's always a very neat tack to take with a film of this nature to filter significant historical events and touchstones through the eyes of children. And there's a very well-intuited demonstration of that type of storytelling by the Davies brothers here, that exactly this explosive revelation of the father as a full, unalloyed man in the eyes of his own children becomes intertwined with a new generation of Nigerians learning anew about events in recent history, and of course, a largely complacent and implicitly biased international audience learning about Nigeria, a country that we nowadays associate more with its popular music influence, those confectionery club-perfect Afrobeats, rather than with either a clear-eyed or even discriminating view of that nation in particular, its particular history and its peoples. That small film format, the 16mm, and again Davies and Edwards' attention to making the narrative feel less like a building up to some climactic explosion, some passionate action made of history, and more to constantly resituating us in the gazes of these two children as their eyes absorb everything from a silent girl at a roadside market to facial hair on the chin of a lady on the bus to exactly the sorts of things that most Western depictions of Lagos in 1993, too fixated on the compartmentalized climactic event, would never think or even know or intuit to include like the Davies brothers do here. Not just haunting glimpses of soldiers on the caravan through a town market, not just headlines in a newspaper of the government denying responsibility in a military barracks massacre, but also things like bizarre snippets of a domestic commercial on a shop television, or again, those magical realist elements that could be the suggestion of some deeper sight into maybe even the spirits that don't seem to haunt Lagos as they do, especially with one woman that catches Remy's eye on an apartment balcony to simply look back at the boys and almost accompany them spiritually through this journey of unspoken mutual revelations. Both what is being dramatically revealed or processed by these characters later in life, as well as what is being revealed and processed to us as outsiders looking in on a version of Nigeria that, and I'm not going to ponce around like I'm some expert of African cinema or the cinema of the African diaspora, I can confidently say that I never saw this sort of filmmaking in Blood Diamond or Hotel Rwanda or The Last King of Scotland. As a millennial child of the post 9/11 world, those were the sorts of movies that were, for my generation, especially middle-class white Americans, that was our primary dramatized window into what Africa was like, into the history of Africa. With its constant, multi-layered, intimate, and sensual sense of looking, of gazing, of processing, and looking back upon, My Father's Shadow also kind of becomes, through its own poetic structure, a countertext that implies so much about what is, to say the least, problematic when we compare it to how more traditional prestige historical dramas produced on the European continent or in the UK or in the United States also inherently look at Africa, look at a nation, look at African and Black peoples. It would, or rather should be enough at this point to simply praise My Father's Shadow, this first feature film of these brothers, for its technical acumen, for the expert way it's written, the way it's shot, its neo-realist contrasting between professional and non-professional styles of performance, all contributing to that effective poetic blurring of the lines between a naturalistic depiction of Nigeria in this period and an emotional memory of it. But since it is Black Film History Month, I'm afraid I'm gonna have to keep the forever discourse going by underlining how critical it is that our ongoing understanding of Black film history and African diaspora film history necessarily implies a revealing critique of the overarching superstructure of white and colonial film history. In Western movies like the aforementioned, white interlocutors are not viewed as essential simply because of an implicit bias against primary identification with a Black or African character, but also a more distressing implicit bias painted by how even when our cinema is, technically speaking, looking out from its borders with apparent excited, edutained interest in the world, at other nations, particularly in this case African nations after de jure colonization, it often feels as if not only these nations, but their very peoples are portrayed in such a hermetic, historically, and geographically compartmentalized fashion that we are indeed being fully voyeuristic, looking in rather than out, diminishing rather than fully taking in that vision of a society, its history, its peoples, as comparable or even larger than us because of how little we know about it. And when Black and African faces and voices are represented in these dramas, I think it's also telling how frequently there needs to be this white, guilt-appeasing rhetorical moment where that same Black or African character emphasizes just how different their experience is than those of our interlocutors, and therefore ourselves as the assumed neutral white American voyeur, suggesting that even when the gaze of those characters is alluded to at all, what is implied is that they are only ever looking out at us with a sense of grievance, even envy. That even as we are the voyeur, we tell ourselves that it is these nations, these peoples, who are the ones who are obsessed with looking at us, for example, and contrast to their own socio-political problems and dysfunctions. It's eerie because one could even interpret these "you just don't understand" moments in movies like these as granting a kind of inherent permission structure to that white Western audience. You just don't understand us, and you never will. And therefore you don't need to try. Whether it's Sierra Leone or Rwanda or Uganda, the films representing seminal events or crises in these various nations were all produced in a very short clip of each other, were all lavishly praised and awarded by a film culture that seemed to be really hot for these scary Africa movies between 2004 and 2006. All of them effectively communicated this paradigm, and quite conveniently during the Iraq War era. Yeah, this period was kind of the peak of mainstream cultural distraction from an international war that we were perpetrating while fascinating ourselves with shit like this. And that paradigm was that the events latched upon by this cycle of films were portrayed as just kind of vaguely endemic, like Africa was just once again being used by Western cinema to represent the veritable grand guignol of human depravity, almost like it is the cradle of civilization, but also the origin of species. Just that classic racist trope of Black peoples and Africa always representing a kind of lowest totem part of human civilization. My Father's Shadow, produced and being distributed at no less of a crucial time in the ascendancy of the very fascist tendencies that this scary Africa cycle served to distract us from in their gestation. This tells us quite a different kind of story and uses a framing to communicate that narrative that is at once shocking and, for us in the imperial core of the white Western world, shamefully discordant with all of that other stuff. Remy and Akin, even these children, are the ones who are constantly looking out. But when they look out at the world, they do not look out obsessively in this grown-up, troubled kid vibe of the scary Africa movie, not like they represent a nation of people with oppositional defiance disorder against their colonial betters. Rather, Remy and Akin are constantly looking out at Nigeria itself, and when they then look out to adults around them, guess what? Those adults are also looking out, but again, not at the Western world, not at the white world, but at their own world, at televisions announcing election schemes, at newspapers that on one page they may read an article in which the government denies their role in that previously mentioned massacre, but on the very next page you have a story not about a Western nation, but about another African country, South Africa in that case, and the article will say something like, "the second apartheid," and you won't really be sure any more than those two children what that means. But simply its representation gives one a distinct sense that, oh, yeah, these nations, these peoples, not simply their material experience, but their fundamental way of just looking out and perceiving and reacting to the world around them is completely and totally salient with what the neutral white observer is constantly being told by our canon of cinema is completely alien to you. It might as well be Journey to the Center of the Earth for as much as we know. There is not a mystical, occult nature to political violence in African countries that makes it impossible for Westerners to understand them, and then just shift the narcissistic goalpost to the vulnerability of self-flagellation for our ongoing, repentant complicity in that violence, divorced from any material cause and effect and therefore possible reparations. You can understand them because the way the Davies brothers present even this more poetic, dreamily fashioned story through the eyes or memories of these children, they show individuals who are both diverse in themselves, but also bound to all the more fundamental emotions that we can all recognize as eternal facets of a universal subjective condition. Going through cycles of optimism and disappointment, patriotism and utter alienation, the feeling that the world is just happening all around us and we're just waiting, crowded around the TV, waiting for it to tell us that the good guys have finally won. My Father's Shadow isn't just a fantastic debut, it also, to maybe distastefully appropriate a colonial aphorism, speaks softly but carries a big stick. It represents a brutally subtle reckoning with all the fantastic lies that have buttressed the Western world, in my case especially the United States, and its sense of quotidian separation from all those awful things that happen in scary Africa or scary Asia or scary Latin America. It's possible that with the word of mouth that this thing deserves, that many a Western observer is going to, for the first time, see a vision of an African nation, its history, its peoples, that even if they can't exactly relate to specifics, still find it immediately salient to a heart of darkness about their own country that they are only just being forced to confront with sheer force. Man, that must have been scary to have lived in Nigeria during that time. Could you imagine how powerless you would feel if the vast majority of people lived in such economic deprivation or desperation that it made even the most basic human relationships fraught with trauma and estrangement, and that beyond it all you could do was helplessly watch as a persistently dysfunctional status quo of politics just kept getting rigged in the favor of the most bloodthirsty, sexually deviant tyrants? And anytime the pendulum feels like it's gonna swing back, you realize that none of the conventional liberal institutions ostensibly offering us the key to new prosperity were constantly abdicating at the last minute, where spontaneous and bespoke scapegoating of political minorities were routine. Like, could you imagine? I'm giving My Father's Shadow a very enthusiastic 4.5 out of 5, a new classic in the canon of films about the simple power of looking. With that, I'm getting out of here. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments, what did I get right, what did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm gonna catch you guys next time.